What is risk assessment? Risk assessment is the process of identifying potential hazards or threats to evaluate their likelihood of occurring and analyze their potential consequences. The goal is to provide decision makers with a clear understanding of the risks facing an organization, project, or activity so that they can implement appropriate measures to manage or mitigate those risks. It is the process of identifying potential risks and analyzing the consequences that could arise from failing to address or improperly managing them. It is proper to conduct suitable and sufficient assessment of the significant risk to employees and of other people's health and safety. It is likewise important that the information on the assessment conducted be communicated to all involved with the task. Risk assessment is important because it protects the health and safety of individuals involved. It improves decision-making process, operational efficiency, and promotes continuous improvements in the organization. Risk assessment helps you understand your vulnerabilities, potentials of bridges, and compliance with the law. Risk assessments should be carried out by the employer or the employer's representative and should involve employees or their representatives in the assessment process. As previously mentioned, workers should also be given information on any conclusions reached, as well as any preventive measures to be taken. Where workers are potentially exposed to injury, a risk assessment must be carried out and suitable controls implemented to prevent or reduce the risk of injury or illness. The 5 steps risk assessment model for conducting a risk assessment are: 1. Identify the hazard and the risk of harm. 2. Identify who could be harmed and how. Evaluate the risk and decide precautions. 4. Record the findings and implement. 5. Review and update when necessary. Let's have a look at number 1, which is to identify the hazard and risk of harm. What is a hazard? A hazard is something with the potential to cause harm and risk the chances of that harm occurring. Identifying the hazard and the risk of harm is the first step in risk assessment. Identifying the hazard and the risk of harm involves assessing the workplace or the task taking place. This is to pinpoint or identify the potential hazards of the workplace or the task taking place. This should involve staff who will be involved in the task or is affected as they have the information involved with the task. When conducting a risk assessment, quantify the risk. Ask questions on how likely the hazard you have identified is likely to cause harm and how severe the consequences could be. Ways one can identify risks include conducting workplace inspections, reviewing past incidents, consulting employees, experts, and specialists who understand the risks. Also, it is important to note the existing controls in place already there to prevent harm to those at risk. For example, an equipment's hazards identified by the manufacturer, issues that have occurred with the task or equipment in the past. Moving forward to step 2, which is to identify who could be harmed and how. Once risks have been identified, the next step is to determine who might be harmed and how the harm could occur. This considers who could be in harm's way during the task. Is it the employees, visitors, contractors, subcontractors, inexperienced workers, pregnant workers, members of the public, or people who share the workspace? Other factors should also be considered, such as people that would not normally be in the facility when this task is being done, and control measures put in place. Step 3 is to evaluate the risk and decide on precautions or control measures. Once risks are identified and affected individuals have been determined, the next step is to evaluate the severity of each risk by assessing likelihood and impact. This step helps organizations prioritize hazards and determine what actions are necessary. After the evaluation of risks, it must be decided what control measures are to be put in place to reduce or eliminate them. When controlling risk, it is important to follow the principles of prevention, which provide a structured approach to managing workplace risks. Proper consideration must be put as to how likely each hazard can cause harm, even after all precautions have been taken, looking at whether the level of risk is acceptable or not. If it is believed that the risk involved with the task is still high, then it should be reviewed and reduced to manageable levels. If also the risk is too significant and cannot be mitigated, it may entail that the activity be stopped until proper controls are put in place. However, continuous evaluations should be conducted with the aim to lower the risk as much as possible and control the risk so that harm is unlikely to occur. It is also important to note that all risks are not the same, as some can be acceptable and managed by some organizations who have the tools and structures, and where, in cases of some other organizations, unacceptable. The fourth step, which is to record the findings and implement. If you employ 5 or more people, then you must record the significant findings of your assessment. This means recording the significant hazards and conclusions. You must also inform your employees or people affected about your findings or conclusions. As a risk assessor, you need to show that proper assessments or checks have been made. This entails that affected persons have been asked the appropriate questions and significant hazards dealt with, taking into considerations the number of people involved and that the precautions are reasonable, and that the remaining risk is low. This information should be recorded to show evidence of it taking place, just in case something happens, as it's easier to defend when put into writing. Step 5. Monitor and review to make sure controls provide suitable protection. Risk assessment is not a one-time process. It must be continuously monitored and updated, as every day things change, and sooner or later new machines, procedures or substances will be introduced which could lead to new hazards. It is good practice to set dates for review of the assessments from time to time to ensure that precautions are still working effectively. If there are issues identified, then they should be addressed immediately. Once addressed, it is important to ensure everyone involved in the process is informed. Here, key monitoring actions include regular inspections, incident tracking, employee feedback, and compliance reviews. By monitoring and updating risk assessments, businesses stay proactive, ensuring ongoing safety and operational success. A simple way of figuring out the overall level of risk is by using a risk matrix. What is a risk matrix? A risk matrix is a tool used to assess and prioritize risks by considering their likelihood and impact. The structure of a risk matrix is typically a table with 2 axes or factors, which are likelihood and impact. We have a likelihood or probability, which denotes how likely the risk is to happen on one side and on my other side. We have the severity or impact, which denotes how severe the consequences will be if the risk occurs. The combination of the two shows the overall level of the risk. The following information will support you in constructing or accurately interpreting a risk matrix. To create a 5x5 risk matrix, first assign a numerical value from 1 to 5 as the likelihood of the event happening, where 1 indicates that there's a very low chance of it happening, and a 5 indicates that it is nearly guaranteed to occur. Then assign a numerical value again from 1 to 5, representing the impact of the injury or its severity, where 1 represents the lowest and would cause a fairly minor injury, and 5 would mean that the consequences would be serious, maybe even fatal. You then multiply the 2 values together. You then plot your hazard on the matrix to see if it falls in the low, medium, or high-risk areas. For example, a person employed with no training in charge of an excavator's likelihood of an accident is extremely high, 5. The impact of the injury, which could result from the accident, would also be a very high 5. The risk level here would be 5/5, which is 25, the highest it could be. Now, if the untrained employee is replaced with a fully trained employee, and the likelihood of an accident reduces to 1. However, it's really important to remember that the impact of any injury could still be 5. The risk would now be 1 multiplied by 5, which is 5. With that, we wrap this session and thank you for joining us on the journey of risks assessment. Please subscribe and like our content to provide feedback and motivate us to continue delivering high-quality content.